got it.
Yep.
Test, 1, 2, very good.
We have already made plans because
All right.
Rocco is going to come with us and we're going out to dinner afterwards. We've already planned that.
Wonderful. So before we get started, there's a couple prayer requests that have been circulating around, and I'll do that, as pastorally as possible. I'm still trying to figure out how to do ministry in post-COVID with like stuff being on YouTube for forever, and so I'm just trying to manage that. So if my prayer seems enigmatic, it's not because I don't care, it's because I'm trying to protect people's privacy. Not everyone wants to know. The world to know they went to the doctor, and it's like, so we'll just we'll do our best. That being said, too, we're going to be in Mark 14 tonight. It's the longest chapter of Mark. It's like 72 verses. So I'm going to teach expositorily. I'm going to try and stick to my notes, and I have a lot of notes. So I think it's a very interesting chapter. We'll do our best. So if you got questions as we go, you're going to have to interrupt me. You're not going to offend me. So it is part of our social agreement. You can just say question, right? And I'll say, oh yeah, sorry, go on. Yeah, go ahead. So let's begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll hop in to this. So gracious Lord, as we gather in this space to study your word and to look at the Gospel of Mark, we know that there are folks near and dear to our heart who need your comfort and healing. We know that there are families who are discerning difficult seasons and what to do with aging parents and everything in between. And so, Lord, we pray that you would bring healing and guidance to these situations. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So, we have got this kind of short summary going on in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to finish Mark 14 tonight. Next week will be Mark 15. And then Mark 16, and we will have read the entirety of Mark altogether. If you've missed a week, that's totally all right. It is all on YouTube. If you want to just type in Greenwood UMC, you can find it. And there it is.
Find it?
Yeah, we're the first one that comes up.
Okay.
There are other Greenwood UMCs,
Yeah.
but we are the first one that comes up.
Oh, good.
No small deal. Okay.
What, Greenwood UMC 1 or
No,
something?
I know, right? Yeah, or the other one. So, all right. So, chapter 1, verses 1 through 13, it's kind of like the setup of our story, right? That's where Mark talks about the gospel and John the Baptist and some other things like that. Then there's this whole entire ministry in Galilee portion, and then there's ministry not in Galilee when he travels a little bit, Jesus and the disciples. Then they go to Jerusalem, and then there's this ministry in Jerusalem, and then we are right thick in the middle of the Passion. We're very familiar with this chapter, right? This is Jesus' like the Last Supper and the betrayal in the garden and the whole kit and caboodle, and he's arrested, and it's all high drama. And then we do the resurrection in chapter 16, and that'll conclude the Gospel of Mark. I'll just refresh our memory that gospel means good news, and it's interesting to kind of take the Bible, put it over here, and say, that's really interesting that the genre, like if you watch a Western, you know what to expect, right? Shootouts, horses, that's what you expect, right? If you watch a samurai film, you know what to expect, right? Swords and chopping and all that stuff. If you watch a romance, you know what to expect. But the genre of gospel was like invented like with Mark. Like it's sort of this propaganda almost. In this way, like we're going to tell you this story in a way that we want you to come to a conclusion. They're not telling the story aimlessly, right? Mark says, I'm telling you the good news of Jesus Christ. It was co-opted also by the Roman Empire, right? If a new emperor was born or something like that, they would say it's the gospel of Julius Caesar. So it's balancing sort of the voices of Rome, which is really interesting. So it's exciting things to kind of look at overall. Previously, on Mark 13, therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. Jesus urging his disciples to stay vigilant. All right, I'm going to do my best to walk through it kind of verse by verse. I'm going to interrupt myself. If y'all want to interrupt me as we go, we can. We're going to pivot, make sure I'm still in screen. Whoop, good, okay. All right. Sure got my notes, and away we go. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of the unleavened bread. We'll stop there for a moment. So we will remember that this is tied to a Jewish ceremony. And the Passover and the festival of the unleavened bread are actually two distinct things. However, they normally go like in the same breath. Sort of like Christmas and New Year's, right? Those are two separate holidays, but everyone knows that's when Macy's has the best deals. So it's just Christmas and New Year's, right? It's the Passover and the festival of the unleavened bread. The destination for the Passover was Jerusalem, and the regular size of Jerusalem during non-high holy times was like 25,000 people. So it's about half the size of Greenwood. And then, when it was race weekend, right?
Yeah.
When it was Passover, it would swell to like 250,000, upwards estimates of 300,000. So you can imagine the public safety concern that Rome had around this, especially considering the whole entire festival is, we got out of oppression, we were liberated from our captors, and we get to wander the wilderness to the promised land. Like that's the story of the Passover. So, imagine going from a small little sleepy backwater town in Rome of 30,000, and it's swelling to like 250,000 people. Hotels are going to be a problem. Fast food restaurants are, the lines are super long. So this is happening all before that. Passover is celebrated on the 14th month of Nisan, which is April and May. Passover is described in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Make sure I get all my things talked about here. Okay, and then the Feast of the Unleavened Bread is paired with Passover, and we'll remind ourselves that unleavened bread, right, is bread without yeast. And the reason why they commemorate this is that bread was prepared quickly. And so you would make it very fast, it's considered kosher, and then you would take it with you on your journey. And so they would take it with them in the wilderness. Okay. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." So Jesus' main conflicts are with, let's just rename them. What groups of people? See if we can get all of them. Scribes, Sadducees, Pharisees,
Elders.
the elders, and the Sanhedrin. Okay? So I was just doing some more research, and during this period in time, there were about 5 families that controlled the high priesthood. They were probably all Sadducees. And the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin are sort of one and the same. The scribes and the Pharisees are sort of like, you can be a scribe and not a Pharisee, but if you're also a Pharisee, you might be a scribe, or probably scribes, like one of those weird reciprocal relationships. So scribes are people who focused on the law, first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the law of Moses. And the Pharisees believed in the oral tradition or the teaching of their fathers. Sadducees did not. So they were strict literalists. They believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They were probably the more conservative branch of Judaism, and they controlled all the power. Sadducees die out after the destruction of the temple. So we know that the Sadducees were tied to almost all temple authorities, all temple activity. And the Sanhedrin, which is like their highest court, is almost exclusively all Sadducees. So those are the people that Jesus has been in conflict with. You could say, pretty accurately in Mark, that his first conflict is with the scribes and the Pharisees. And then obviously as he gets closer to Jerusalem, he becomes more embroiled in conflict, right, with the temple authorities and these individuals. Questions so far?
Just a comment, I had no idea it grew to that size during Passover, and it's no wonder that the Roman hierarchy was worried about the crowd.
Yep, and we'll see some of
They're
the
all Jews.
Yes, that's right, and it will come into, I think, stark contrast as we go into Mark 14, because they're going to make a decision that they're going to kill Jesus, and then they don't have the authority to do so, which is interesting. And we'll talk about who has the authority in Roman society and what that looks like. So if you haven't catched on, kind of all the orange are things I want to just like make a little comment on. If you see something that's not an orange that you want to make a comment on, just holler at me and we'll have some conversation about it. So while he was at Bethany again is a suburb of Jerusalem. It's about 2 miles outside. It's on the Mount of Olives, which is to the east of the city. In the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. So here, I think it's interesting, this is Simon the leper. Some people think this is Simon, the guy who carries the cross, because they have the same name. I think they would say that's Simon the leper. They call him Simon the Cyrene, so there's just some parallels there. I think it's a different Simon, but we cannot know because they're all dead and we weren't there. So, but interesting that he no longer has leprosy. This is like, Simon, the guy who used to have leprosy and got better. It's like that Monty Python skit. So, and there he is at this house in Bethany where Jesus is connected with, and he's reclining at this table, right? So they did not have tables like this in ancient Near East. They would have been low tables, and they would have been reclining on like a couch, like a chaise lounge sort of thing, or even on the floor. They'd been very low to the ground. And then a woman comes with an alabaster jar, a very costly ointment of nard. So, the nard is an aromatic oil. It's a native root of India, which I didn't know, kind of like where it came from. But it goes to also remind us that the reason why Israel, even to this day, is so important is because it's like sometimes called the land between, right? It touches 3 continents. It touches Europe, it touches Africa, and it touches Asia. And you really only have to go over like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, that little peninsula right there, and then you're in the subcontinent of India. So it's pretty important for trade, right? It's the entire eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And so if you were on a boat and you were, let's say, over in that western part of Africa, and you wanted to trade with, let's say, modern day Spain or France or Italy, you didn't like just really go across the Mediterranean. It was safest to travel that coastline because the odds of shipwreck would be a lot less. And you could also navigate a lot easier if you could see the coast. If you're out in the middle and a storm comes in, you lose the stars, right? There's no GPS, you can't navigate. It's bad. So you stay by the coast, and that's why this area is so vitally important. So the nard is from India, which makes sense. It would have been in a sealed alabaster jar. Like when we think of perfume, I know you ladies, you think of like, it's perfume, right? Spray, or whatever. But not then. They didn't have those. It would have been in a jar, and you would have had to break the neck of this long-necked bottle. And to do so, that's your intent to use it, And so she breaks the bottle, and it is extremely expensive. She poured the ointment on his head. Verse 4. Some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. I've always found it difficult to determine the tone here. Are they really upset? Are they posturing again? Right? The disciples have been arguing about who's going to be the greatest, who's the best disciple, who's not going to leave Jesus, all these things. Are they really angry? It says they were angry. So let's take that at face value. They're probably upset. It could have been used to, help the poor. And Jesus thinks that their motives are a little less than pure. Yeah. I wrote down that I thought it was a little pretentious anger. They also probably became angry because it was customary on the night of the Passover to remember the poor with gifts. And this was also a part of the Passover to give 1 part of a second tithe. And so you sort of double down on your tithe for the year to help the church, right? And this was all part of giving to the poor and the needy. And so when this happens, it is sort of in contrast to this season that's happening in their lives, which is the Passover. So she's also anointing him, which is very common in the ancient Near East. But it also has echoes of what's going to happen later, which is when they go to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, and he's not there. And so, this is like that pre-funeral anointing very kind of like dire situation that they are unaware of.
And kings were anointed,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, yeah, the
So
Messiah was
I always
anointed.
felt like she was kind of saying, "You're my king."
Yeah, and Jesus is going to say something very similar. You know, it says like whenever the Gospels talked about, her name will be mentioned as well. So like, the disciples have not done this, and she recognizes his importance and does that for him. So verse 6 says, Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She's given a good service for me. You will always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body before for its burial. And truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Some people will say that this is the tipping point, right, for Judas. Because this next verse says, "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, them being the chief priests, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him."
Judas could have taken that money and spent it on himself,
Or the poor.
maybe.
Maybe. Yeah. Or himself. So I wrote down one little note here. I said, you'll notice that Judas's motive is not discussed. And I don't think I caught that until reading Mark for the 15th time. You know, like, it doesn't say. It doesn't say why he did what he did.
He was the money keeper.
He was the money keeper. I think Matthew tells us that. I don't remember which gospel does. So you could say from Matthew's perspective, right, his betrayal might have had to do with money.
He was sent by God to do it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, God,
Isn't
it was
he
all
the last?
pre-planned.
Well, you know, I don't
I
know.
don't know either.
I don't know. Right? Because, you know, as good Methodist Wesleyans, right, we believe in free will and we believe that God honors our choices. And so I think a good Methodist Wesleyan theology would say that Judas made the choice to betray Jesus. Was it within the divine providence of God that it would happen? Yes. But did God preordain Judas to do that ahead of time? Probably not.
Somebody had to do it. It was a dirty job.
It was a dirty
Someone had
job.
to do it.
I've also heard it this way, this sort of analogy of Judas's free will, or maybe our own sinful nature, that it's like when you play your grandkiddos or your kiddos in chess. It's like they make a bad move, but you let them make the bad move, and you just keep playing anyways, you know. And they might win, they might lose, but at the end of the day, you want to honor their choice, their choice. And somehow it still works out in the grand scheme of things because they're still playing chess, right? Judas is still playing life.
I always think that Satan is alive and well. He might have had a little bit to do with
A little bit of a
Judas.
role. And that's interesting, right? Because that's not discussed here. We know Satan's alive and well in the Gospel of Mark because there's been supernatural encounters with demons, there's been exorcisms, and Satan himself has come and tempted Christ. And so he's played a role, you know, explicitly there. And maybe he's slipped more into the background in the back half of Mark. It's a good point.
Was Judas the last of the 12 to be chosen?
I don't remember. We could flip back to Mark
was.
3. Is that right, where we get the list? And of course, just because we have the list doesn't mean that that's the order it happened in.
But that does it describe there that he's Judas, the one that betrayed him?
I'm looking. Was it in 3 or was it in 2? Do y'all remember?
3, maybe. No, I don't remember.
Someone find it. What verse are you in? Oh, there. It's like 16, right? Yep. He appointed the 12. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. James, son of Zebedee. John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Banangarang, or whatever that is. That is Sons of Thunder. And Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So he's listed last. Yeah. Which is, again, this isn't necessarily the order in which they've
No,
been
I know.
called, but
When I watched The Chosen,
yeah,
Judith was the last one.
interesting. So, what do we know about Judas?
He's a money keeper.
What does Mark tell us about Judas? What does Mark tell us about Judas?
He said to him, do what you're going to do and do it quickly.
Yeah,
He was the
he's a
one-
zealot.
We've talked about this, I think, before. but
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I've read about Judas was that he did this to make Jesus become the Messiah. And he felt that if he forced the issue, Jesus would say, I'm taking over, and I will lead you against the Romans, and he would take his place as a true Messiah. But it backfired, and it didn't work that way.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
like, so
yeah.
I did this, and what does Judas end up doing? Hanging
Hanging
himself.
himself.
Yeah,
Because he said, I was wrong, I made a mistake, I didn't know that Jesus would not.
be the
Right
warrior
back-
king.
yeah, Be the warrior king, and he thought he would force the issue, and he was a zealot, so he was a fighter, he goes, let's do this.
Yeah.
And he didn't.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to examine his motives, right? The text tells us very little. We should just be honest about that, right? It doesn't say he did this because he wanted the money, or there are traditions, that we have within the church, but Mark's rather silent on the issue.
I like Pat's explanation better than mine.
Well, well, it's interesting, and we've talked about this, right? Because, why does the disciple have a sword? And then,
Oh, because he's got to be where there's wild animals.
well, yeah, you could say, it's just a long knife. There's different Greek for like a tool,
Uh-huh.
and there's a different word for like a military sword, and
The first time he sent them out, they took no sword, no sandals, no nothing. And the second time they went out well prepared.
they did. And Luke talks about that. The Gospel of Luke. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know where stuff is. I just know it's in there.
Okay, yeah. Luke tells them to take swords with them. But in the garden, we'll get there. I think I'm just going to say it, that Mark does not tell us Judas's motives. And so we have to fill in the gap. And we can make some assumptions based on what we know. But it's important to read Mark for Mark, which can be hard. Okay. Also, I said, is this it? I think it's it. No, that's later. Okay. I about got ahead of myself. Dangerous business. Verse 12. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb was sacrificed, I'm going to pause for a moment, right? Another temporal mark in time, telling us what's going on. So just note the Passover wording, and it comes back to our context about the Passover and the season. His disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as he had told them. And they prepared the Passover meal. So, the background here is that they're preparing to eat the Seder dinner. And the Seder dinner, for all of those folks who need a refresher on our Judaism, is the meal that they would eat to commemorate the Passover. And each of the dishes of the Seder meal serve a particular point. There's like the bitter herbs, and they would resemble the bitterness of slavery. There is like stewed fruit, which is supposed to resemble the bricks. And then so all the things have a symbol behind them and a meaning. There's like a poached egg, there's the Paschal lamb, or the Passover lamb, or meat on a shank, and it's supposed to remind people of the sacrifice, right, of the death of the firstborn, and how the Spirit of God passed over the Hebrew houses, and that ultimately, through that sacrifice of death, they were allowed to leave Pharaoh's reign. So that's just the background here. I found it very fascinating. It says they found everything as he had told them. And I read like 4 commentaries, and none of them said anything about that. Right?
Mark did.
It's the Messiah. He's saying like, this is what you're gonna find. You're gonna encounter that. And I wonder if they were like, sure, okay, yeah, you haven't been wrong before, right? If they were like, well, all right, if you say so, I don't know. I just think it's a really interesting tidbit. It also really reminds me of. Does it remind anybody of anything else? Just curious.
When the donkey, he told them to go
Yeah.
get the donkey
get the
and where it
donkey.
would be. And
Yeah, and that just
Kind of
happened last
see that
last
really-
chapter, right? When he tells them to go to Bethany, you'll find the colt tied there. Tell them the Lord needs it. It's
Yeah.
like the same sort of
Yeah.
theme and motif that they're encountering. Verse 17, when it was evening, he came with the 12, and when they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. They began to be distressed and to say to him, one after another, surely not I. He said to them, it is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it was written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born.
that's harsh.
That's harsh. That's harsh. Yikes. Thoughts on this section so far? Yes.
So if not Judas, whom?
Right. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So some church traditions, right? Well, this is that conversation we've been having. Will say he was appointed for this task. You know, God had arranged it as such. Others will say that Judas made this choice of his own free will, and Jesus is aware that choose your metaphor, right? That the cards are in motion, the stars have aligned. It is like things have been happening, and so this is the natural outcome of these activities.
So Judas has been destined to hell?
I don't like that, but go ahead. Yeah.
From like maybe day 2. I'm not gonna say day 1. but
Right.
I mean, from the beginning of all of this, as things have played out, he has that fate, if you will.
Yeah. So, let me give you a Methodist response, shall I? Or maybe we can flirt with this as much as we like for a little bit
What
of
does the
time
other
here.
gospel say about Judas?
Well, I want to read Mark for Mark,
Okay.
you know,
Yeah.
and I do think so. Let's just take a couple snapshots. We know that Judas is going to betray Jesus, right?
Mhm.
Jesus just said that. And then in Mark, Judas leads them there. He kisses them, and then Judas is gone. Judas is not mentioned again in the Gospel of Mark.
Oh, okay.
So
We don't know about the field.
we don't know about the field. I think that's from Acts, you know, or maybe I don't quote me, that's off the top of my head. You know, we don't know about the field, you know, that was purchased for the 30 silver where he goes and hangs himself. I don't think we even know the amount, you know, in Mark. It doesn't tell us.
Oh, okay.
So, sorry.
Excuse me. I was playing footsie.
Let me see if we can tackle this question, and that's plagued theologians for thousands of years in a few minutes. So God creates all things, right? And he calls it good and very good.
Mhm.
So I doubt in the very beginning of the foundation, God knew that Adam and Eve were going to screw it all up.
They did,
Right.
they did.
Well, I mean, let's play with this. If God knew that, and he created them anyways, why?
He wanted them to be perfect.
Well, I think
Right.
he created them perfect. He
did.
says it's very good. That's what it says. It says tov matov in Hebrew. It
That's
means
right,
very
but
good.
He gave them free choice.
Yeah, come on now. I know, right?
And
Yeah.
they chose to mess up.
Yes.
They just didn't know how badly they were.
Right. And so,
I was gonna say.
well, so
haven't
maybe
we
so does
all?
Judas, right? He had a choice. And so I think you can read it as, right, he's been predestined, or you can read it as he had a choice. And I think you can read both faithfully in the text. Does that, I mean, I'm not trying to find a cop-out. I think both are there.
Yes.
And I think oddly enough, and this is a huge discussion, I do think there's this idea within the Christian tradition of, I don't want to say fate or destiny or like things set in stone, but like no one chose to be born in America in this room, right? You didn't choose to be born with blonde hair, you didn't, like,
Or gray hair.
or gray hair, like these things they're just, I get what I get. And so, in a sense, there is some prearranging of things that are far outside of anyone's control. But at the end of the day, I still have to make choices and live my life. At least I perceive that I do. So I do think Judas makes choices. And I think Jesus sees what Judas is doing and knows what Judas is doing. And I think ultimately Judas makes the choice to betray him. I don't think he has no control over his actions.
You mean you don't think Judas has any control?
Is that what I not said?
No,
That's
no.
okay. That's what I mean.
Okay,
I think Judas does have control over his actions.
okay.
I think he has control over his actions. I don't think he had to do it.
Somebody had to do it.
Oh,
Not
why?
necessarily.
Why?
Because Jesus was destined to die, and he knew it.
But he could have died without Judas betraying him.
Well, somebody had to do it, that's what I
But
said.
he's caused all this turmoil. They're out to get him.
I think it is a paradox. I don't know if we're gonna answer it. Go ahead. I see some other thoughts. So.
Let's take a vote.
I thought Judas had taken money because he was a treasurer. Not in Mark, but I thought somewhere.
I think it's in Matthew. I think so. But again, we're not reading Matthew, so I haven't read it recently because I've been reading Mark. So, but I think it's in Matthew. And then if that's the case, let's say it's in Matthew or Luke or John. Let's say it's in one of the other Gospels. Right? We could remember that it's traditionally said that Mark was the first Gospel written. And so if Mark was written first, then the other Gospels have Mark's Gospel to elaborate on, or to say, let's put in some motive here, like Mark forgot to tell him why he did it, or things of that nature.
I forgot to tell him that Mary always wears blue.
Yeah, right. Okay, so yeah, I'm not sure we're going to satisfy our curiosity on that, but it's a fantastic question.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I've said it. I do think he has his choices to make. I think I'm trying to think of an analogy to describe it. Imagine like if I stood up in the pulpit on Sunday and I draped myself in an American flag, held up an AR-15, and claimed the beauty of our Bill of Rights. Like, I think I'd make some people upset. You know what I mean? And so I think you could say, and do it the other way too. Like, imagine I stood up on Sunday and I draped myself in a pride flag and I claimed, about the equal rights of everyone in this country. You know what I mean? I think I'd make some people upset, regardless. And so I think you could say, oh, Josh, you've just pushed the dominoes, right? And you had a choice, and you pushed the dominoes, and the writing's on the wall. So I think that's kind of how I view Judas's action. It's like Jesus is like, you pushed the domino, Judas. Like the writing is on the wall. Like, I know what you're trying to do here, and it's not going to end. So for our discussion, right? It's not going to end how you think it's going to end. My kingdom is not what you think it is.
I think it's interesting that he even mentioned that night. They think they're there for the Passover meal, and then out of the blue, Jesus says this.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, where'd that come from?
Yeah. And right, it's been boiling to... the conflict has been there, which we encountered, right? In chapter 3, it says they began to seek out a way to kill him. And so it's boiling.
Yeah, we don't know, but that various disciples may have been approached by the leaders before.
Okay, well, you bring up a really valid point, and that's something we've not really talked about, is when a single disciple is named. Sometimes we miss this in 2023, that in our American individualisms, we're like, Josh has a question, right? So I go ask my teacher the question. But in that society, it was much more like communal. And so some people think that Judas was just like the fall man. Some people think that like all the disciples are like, okay, we're on the same page here, right? We're gonna force his hand. Peter, you got the sword, you're good. Okay, Judas, you got the money. Like, it's just an interesting read. Like, all the disciples want Jesus to usher in his kingdom. They've been arguing about who's going to be the greatest in his kingdom, who's going to sit at his right hand. So they're all in this together.
And he taught him to pray, thy kingdom come.
It's just an interesting read, to think that there's more communal activity rather than individual evil intent.
Maybe. And yet when Jesus said, one of you will betray me, and each one asked, is it I, Lord? At least that's in the show.
Well, yeah, no, it was there, right? Truly, I tell you this night.
I think each one asked, is it not?
Well, don't the Jewish people today still feel that the Messiah is to come,
Yeah.
and he will come
Yes.
that way, the way
Yeah.
the disciples wanted him to come.
Yes.
He will come if Jesus returns, but for them, it's the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
they still believe that, I think.
And thanks for raising that up. This thing that I handed out a little bit earlier was from a question we had last week about this messianism, this kind of Messiah fever. That the Messiah is going to come and rescue us. It's a pretty scholarly article, but it does talk about that. And to say it's a single monolithic view, like all Jews think this is what the Messiah looks like, the article does a very good job of talking about saying, no, not really. There's kind of two views. Excuse me, that's Taco Bell. There's two views primarily. Like the Messiah, who has not yet come, is going to either restore Israel or they're going to set up sort of a new Israel, a new kingdom. And you can read about that a little bit if you like. I'm gonna move us along. Is that okay? So that we can hop through all this. Are we on 22?
Yeah.
Okay. While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." I'm going to pause and consult my notes because I have a lot to say about this, and I want to make sure I get it right. So let's remember that Mark was written probably around AD 66 or 70. And there's other words that are found about this sort of institution of the Lord's Supper, right? You'll hear me say this in the first of the month, these words. And then those words are found in 1 Corinthians 13 written by St. Paul. And 1 Corinthians 13 was written earlier than Mark, which is interesting to think that maybe Mark, who's writing the first gospel about Jesus and creating the material for Matthew, Luke, and John, is maybe borrowing some wording from Paul, which has been circulating. There's no Xerox, there's no emails, there's no books. Like, it's been circulating. These letters have been circulating, and Paul's written it down. And before that, they've been saying it. It's been an oral tradition that they've been saying these things. So that's sort of captured there. If you're interested in reading about the Last Supper stuff, that's in 1 Corinthians 11. But here, the Passover liturgy, which I think is really interesting. So I wrote it down because I've not read it before. So this is what the Jews will say during their Seder dinner. This is the bread of affliction which our father ate in the land of Egypt. Let everyone who hungers come and eat. Let everyone who is needy come and eat the Passover meal. And of course it's called the bread of affliction because it's poor and simple. And all those different sides were set out. And then that bread would have been
Hard.
incredibly difficult and not super flavorful, and he blesses it and he breaks it and gives it to his disciples. When they're finished, this is in verse 26, it says, when they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away, for it is written." I'm going to stop there for a second. So it was tradition when they finished the Passover meal to sing from the book of Psalms. And this section of Psalms are called the Hallel Psalms, Hallel, and they are Psalms 113 through 118. And I think he would have read Psalm 118 at the very end because it's what he would have done as he was walking up. Did I copy it? Of course I didn't.
No, it's not real long then.
It's not super long, but I do want to read it so you can hear the words that are probably on their lips, right? As they go out to the garden.
We could have a cedar meal. We had them before. They're very interesting.
So, I'm going to say it again. So they take the bread, they break it. This is my body, and this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. And then they sing the hymn as they go out to the Mount of Olives. Okay. They're singing the hymn, right? They're walking out, and they're going to the Mount of Olives. And this is the hymn they're singing. Psalm 118, it says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his steadfast love endures forever. Out of my distress I called on the Lord, and the Lord answered me and set me in a broad place. With the Lord on my side, I do not fear. What can mortals do to me? The Lord is on my side to help me. I shall look in triumph on those who hate me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to put confidence in mortals. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to put confidence in princes. All nations surrounded me. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. They surrounded me on every side. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. They surrounded me like bees. They blazed like a fire of thorns. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my might. He has become my salvation. There are glad songs of victory in the tents of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. The right hand of the Lord is exalted. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. I shall not die, but I shall live, and recount the deeds of the Lord. The Lord has punished me severely, but he did not give me over to death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it. I thank you that you have answered me and have become my salvation." These words will sound familiar to you.
Sounds like David.
The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It's marvelous in our eyes. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Save us, we beseech you, O Lord. O Lord, we beseech you. Give us success. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. They just sang that last week in chapter 13.
Yeah.
We bless you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is God, and he has given us light. Bind the festal procession with branches up to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I'll give thanks to you. You are my God, I will extol you. I'll give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. And then they come out into the garden, because they're done with their mealtime. They're at the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even though all fall away, I will not." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said vehemently, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." All of them said the same.
But Judas wasn't there anymore. The other 11. Judas had already left.
I don't think it says
It
that.
doesn't, I don't think it says it in
Maybe not in Mark.
I know, yeah, maybe not in Mark, right? But there, I mean, I don't know. He might be there, he may not be there. It doesn't say. It says all of them. I'm assuming all the disciples, they say the same.
Okay.
And he's quoting Zechariah 13:7, where he says, "For it's written, I'll strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." And in the context of Zechariah 13, it's the command that God gives that the shepherd will be struck down and the sheep will be scattered as a part of the refining process and the creation of a new people of God. There is further reflection on the cleansing of the house of David. So Mark, we will remember, right, uses the Old Testament a lot. What have been some of the citations from the Old Testament that you've heard out of the prophets that Mark uses to talk about this Jesus person?
All those things is Isaiah
Yep,
3
Isaiah.
or something. I don't remember where. Mark 3.
Yeah, no, Isaiah is used a lot in Mark. Probably the most. Others? Book of Daniel, Zechariah. So there's a bunch of different prophets that have been named and quoted. Questions on this section? Doing good? All right, I'm going to push on. So they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples. So Gethsemane, let me get my notes here. Where did they go? It's an olive orchard at an estate at the foot of the Mount of Olives. So they're not, they're right outside the city. In Hebrew, Gethsemane means oil press. And so it's thought to be a place where they pressed olive oil in this area.
Really handy.
Yeah, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter, James, and John and began to be distressed and agitated. So Peter, James, and John get to go on a little field trip with Jesus, a little bit further deeper in still, right? They're the inner three. You have the whole 12, inner three, and then Peter. And Peter, James, and John are taken a little bit deeper into Gethsemane in this area. He says, "My soul is deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." So I did some research on this distressed and agitated. I thought it was really interesting. You'll notice that Peter, James, and John are taken. Peter has just said, "I'll never desert you, Lord." Right? So he gets to go a little bit further. And James and John in Mark 10 are having this discussion. Does someone want to grab Mark 10, verses 38 through 40?
I can tell it says, which of us will be with you? Which of us will sit on your right and left hand?
Oh, not that one.
Not that one?
No, it's all right.
I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. Mark 10, 38 through 40. So whenever you get it, just go ahead and read it. I got to turn back to Mark because I was in Psalms.
You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? We can, they answered. He said to them, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared.
Okay, so they're asking, can we drink the cup? And then, of course, Jesus is going to say in just a few short verses, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, this cup of suffering, right? And that they are asking, and then Jesus is saying, Lord, we are willing to drink this cup. So you could say, why are Peter, James, and John kind of allowed to go on this neat little field trip with Jesus, right? It's because they're the ones who keep saying, we'll never leave you. We're willing to drink from this cup. And so Jesus is saying, okay. Okay. Put your money where, your mouth is. And then he's distressed and agitated. So look this up. The distressed means sore amazed in Greek. It's only used 4 times in the entire New Testament, all in Mark. I thought that's interesting. So Mark's the only one who uses this word. And it means like to be amazed, astonished, or awestruck. And so it doesn't really mean distressed. It means like dumbfounded.
Yeah.
Like, what? Right?
Oh,
So
I never read it that
he
way.
took with him Peter, James, and John and began to be dumbfounded and agitated. It literally means very heavy. So sorrowful. You could say almost depressed. It's used 3 times in the New Testament, and it means to be troubled, great distress, or anguished, or depressed.
So great. So distressed doesn't mean.
Right, it doesn't, yeah. And he
That's
said
an
to them,
oxymoron.
my soul is deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. Which he had just told them to do, right? Last chapter he said, be vigilant. And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father. So Abba is Aramaic for dad. It's a familial term. It doesn't quite mean daddy. That's what people have, maybe preached on before. You've heard that Abba means daddy, but it just means like papa, like father. It's a familial term. It's like when my son says dad. It's the way he means it, right? It's Abba. But when I say dad to my dad, I might say, hey, dad, and that just means dad. But if I say, like, hey, dad, can I take the car to prom? It's like, dad, can I take the car to prom, please? So it's Abba, it's like...
Can I have the car?
Yeah, it's familial, it's passionate. For you, all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's be going. Look, my betrayer is at hand." Thoughts?
Well, it kind of answers a question for me as to why you don't preach for an hour. You preach for an hour, we
I'm
go
gonna fall asleep. I'm gonna fall asleep. You know? What can you do?
Wait, you can't even stay awake for an hour?
I know, right?
12, 15, 20 minutes, we're good.
Oh, good. An hour is too long. There's an example, right? Immediately, Mark's favorite word, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. So rabbi means teacher or master. It can mean both of those things. I thought it was interesting that Judas calls him that. And we've had all this discussion about like the title that one should give to Jesus. And you would think he would call him
Master.
or Lord. Yeah, Messiah or Christ. They just had this discussion in Mark chapter 8. Who do you say that I am? Some say you are the Christ. Don't tell anybody. The Son of Man must go on to suffer many things. And here he is saying, Rabbi. It's like, Judas, that's not his title. I just thought it was interesting. And he kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest. We are told in a different gospel, I think it's the Gospel of John. Checking. Yep. So John tells us that this is Peter who pulls out a sword and cuts off the servant's ear. The servant's name is Malchus, told us elsewhere. And then you also notice that all the disciples right now, after they cut off his ear, Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a rebel?" Yes, that's exactly what they think you are. "Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching. You did not arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." All of them deserted him and fled. A certain young man, we'll stop there, verse 50. So apparently all the disciples are able to get out of this entanglement without getting captured. They all flee.
Really, only Peter, James, and John are with him, right?
Well, yeah, so like tradition is that all the disciples go to the garden, and then he takes with him Peter, James, and John, and they go like deeper into the garden. And then, so he's further in the back of the like orchard, if you will, and then he comes back forward to where they all are napping. So whether it is just Peter, it's a good question, because Mark doesn't say, it says that they're all there, but
He
who's
says,
them?
"Rise, let us go, here comes my betrayer." I assume he went back to where everyone else was.
Yeah, Judas, right? So there were at least 11, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, when Jesus and Peter and James and John went back. I'm assuming when he says,
I mean, they could have been-
"Rise, let us go, here comes my betrayer."
Yes.
They could have been hiding in the trees.
The
The other 11, the other 8.
They could have been. Yeah, they could have said, they're here, they come, we're getting out of here. I don't know. So, all of them deserted him and fled. This is in verse 50. 51. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. But you didn't know that was in the Bible, did you? That's kind of exciting. It's very interesting. That one never makes those, those plays. No one ever volunteers to go streaking off the church stage. Some people think that this is an allusion, a little editorial mark, that this is actually Mark himself, that he was there that night. It's known that Mark lived in Jerusalem, and he might have witnessed this very event. There's some other interesting commentary about how in the book of Amos there is a young man dressed in linen who will not be able to withstand the righteousness on the day of the Lord. And so you could say maybe it's that. I don't know. Ultimately, we don't know. I think it's a very interesting little story about this one guy who apparently gets away. Because I think this ultimately says he was hastily dressed, right? There's a certain young guy, he's not really wearing the appropriate clothes. And they're trying to capture him, and he runs. He flees.
they step on his clothes and he goes.
Right.
They tear them off of him and he goes there.
All right, we're doing
Well,
okay.
it
I'm
was-
going to keep
it was
pushing
in the
on here.
bag.
Verse 53. So they took Jesus to the high priest and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. Right? These are the people he's been in conflict with. And they were all assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance. So Peter gets away, but he's not done yet. Right? He's going to see what he can do.
He's got betrayed.
Yeah, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. So there's all these competing testimonies. Well, I'm going to keep reading. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I'll destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another, not made with hands.' But even on this point, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?' But he was silent and did not answer." All right, so Jesus' response is one of silence, and he is required by the law to answer his accusers. So, of course, he's frustrating this whole entire process. Jesus in Mark, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you think Jesus has claimed to be the Messiah in the Gospel of Mark so far?
No, he hasn't claimed it, but he has let them claim it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think he's allowed other people to say it for him, and he's let his actions and deeds speak for themselves. So it's interesting to say that he's not claimed to be the Messiah. And remember that Peter does claim him to be the Messiah in Mark chapter 8. Mm-hmm. Jesus was careful not to stoke the political and nationalistic tensions of all the kind of baggage around the word Messiah. We're going to come to like what he says ultimately at the very end, because it's very climactic, I think, if you read it, with some drama. But I want to hear, I'll read to you all from Jeremiah 26, because this is their main concern, is that the temple's going to be destroyed. Mm-hmm. This is the testimony that's being brought against him, even though it's not aligning. And so the desecration of a holy place is a capital offense in Judaism. If you were to desecrate a shrine, right, they would stone you. Mm-hmm. So very quickly, I'll read Jeremiah 26:7 through 10. It says, "The priests, the prophets, and all the people heard Jeremiah speak these words in the house of the Lord. But as soon as Jeremiah finished telling all the people everything the Lord had commanded to him, the priests, the prophets, and all the people seized him and said, 'You must die. Why do you prophesy in the Lord's name that this house will be like Shiloh, and this city will be desolate and deserted?' And all the people crowded around Jeremiah in the house of the Lord." Pause for a moment to reflect that Jeremiah is that prophet that tells the people that Jerusalem is going to be ransacked by the Babylonians. And they don't like that. And Jeremiah gets, basically, they're going to kill him. Mm-hmm. Because you can't say that they're going to tear down the temple. So Jesus is kind of running into this Jeremiah moment in Old Testament prophetic literature. So the high priest asks him again, "Are you the Messiah?" Go ahead.
Where in Jeremiah is that?
Chapter 26.
Okay, just curious because we're doing Jeremiah in Sunday school.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Just fast forward, we'll come back. And he says, "Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, 'Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?'" Okay. So Jesus responds. He says, "I am, and you'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and the coming with the clouds of heavens." It's a combination of Psalm 110, Daniel 7, and Isaiah 52. Mm-hmm. Jesus is saying, "I am that one predicted by the prophets. I am the Messiah. Here is this moment." And then the high priest, who's Caiaphas, mm-hmm. he pulls his robe apart because it is blasphemy. Remember that the charges of blasphemy were introduced in chapter 2. With the healing of the paralyzed man, when Jesus says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And then they're saying, "You don't have the authority to do that, Jesus. You can't forgive sins. That's blasphemy. Only God can do that." And the Pentateuch outlines blasphemy in Leviticus 24. Jesus' blasphemy is an infringement on God and God's majesty and diminishes his honor. And so an execution by a Jewish court is I don't know, that's what they're going to do, right? So what's your decision? All of them condemned him as deserving death. This is verse 64. And then some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." The guards also took him and beat him. So you can picture this, that Jesus makes this proclamation, and they say that is worthy of death.
Mhm.
And they bind him, they blindfold him, and they would circle around him, sort of spitting on him, mocking him, as it says. And then they would almost hit him, and saying, the idea of prophesy here is like, tell us who just hit you. You know, if I hit you, did you know it was me? Can you do that? Because the Messiah could do that. So they have this idea of who the Messiah is and what he should be able to do, and then they are mocking him in this instance. Only the procurator, which is a Roman title, could carry out capital offenses. So they say he's worthy of death, but they can't do it. They especially can't do it during Passover because the crowd likes Jesus, right? We go all the way back. Yeah, to verse 1 of 14. The chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." So here they are, catching him by, stealth and condemning him to death. And the only person who could carry out the capital offense was the procurator, who happens to be the Roman governor, who's Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate was three things really. He was prefect, procurator, and governor. And yes, there's some debate about all of that. Shocker. And this is it. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the female servants of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also are with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed, and the female servant, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you're one of them, for you're a Galilean, and you talk like one." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. I only have a few notes here, right? Galileans are mentioned in the Talmud as having a very distinct dialect, right? It's like when you find someone, you can tell they're from Georgia, or from Texas. It's like, I know where you're from. Yeah. So he's a Galilean. He talks all funny. And so that's how they recognize him. I thought this was very interesting that he began to curse and he swore an oath. And I looked up and down for all sorts of things around this, and I found very little that satisfied me. Except for the curse word. The word curse is that he is cursing his circumstances, himself. It's not necessarily it doesn't have an object in the grammar and the structure. So he's just cursing in general as opposed to cursing anything in particular. Does that make sense? So it's interesting that St. Peter cursed. I mean, just saying, right? It's in the Bible. So, and then he swears an oath. And oaths in that day were, they were a big deal. If you swore an oath, obviously you were bound to that oath. And so he's recognizing his failure of discipleship in this moment. Okay. What do you think? Questions? Thoughts?
Well, I believe in that dialect thing, for sure.
Yeah.
Because even when we go to Michigan, up in Michigan, they say, "You guys got the cutest accent." I always say, "No, you do."
Yeah, you can tell. It's interesting that made the cut into our scriptures.
I think he knew some things because he knew that Peter was going to deny him 3 times.
Yeah.
He has some
He knew
information.
the cock would crow.
Yeah. Talking about Jesus, right? We've had this discussion about how much does he know.
Right.
Yeah, that was a form of prophecy or pre-knowledge. Yes, I do not disagree with you at all. All right, that's
It's a wonderful story, just a wonderful story.
It is. And 15 is going to be really difficult to read. Just prepare yourselves now. It's the unfun chapter. And then 16 has some very interesting bits to it.
But we're going to do them both next week.
We'll see.
Okay. all right,
Yeah.
all right.
I would love to have a week of sort of just talking about different parts, but I think I've committed to 2 more weeks. So if 15 takes 1 week and 16 takes 1 week, that's what it is.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Summary.
Yeah. Good? All right, I'll offer a word of prayer, and then I'll linger if you all have any additional questions. Gracious Lord, thank you for this time and being able to gather in this space. As we go from here, we pray that you grant us rest and keep us safe until we meet again. May the words of Mark continue to infiltrate our lives. May they form and shape our hearts and minds, that we would be found as faithful disciples for you in your kingdom. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.
You have a fun trip. Thank you.